In my first video on the Netflix adaptation of One Piece, I brought up how it had taken the place in my mind that was previously reserved for the Netflix adaptation of Death Note. Likewise, I admitted that I used to watch the Death Note movie at least once a year because I couldn't get it out of my head. Naturally, since the One Piece show has supplanted the Death Note movie in my life, I now watch it in a similarly repetitive and mildly obsessive manner. I used to joke that every time I rewatched the Death Note movie, it was with the hope that it would be better than I remembered. The truth to that joke is that I wanted to convince myself that I wasn't crazy for watching something I didn't like with such a regular cadence. While I never succeeded in convincing myself, the exercise made me good at distancing a work from my previously held notions in an attempt to find something that I had missed. I of course now apply that same logic, though not the same delusions, to my rewatches of One Piece. During this year's viewing, my lens became the exact opposite of the one I took on my first watch. Instead of looking at what and how the showrunners adapted from the original, I focused on the complete deviations from the source material. Things that are made up from whole cloth and themes that are unique to the show. And with this year's rewatch leading directly into my first viewing of Season 2, that lens carried over to the new material as well. And I came away as impressed with the show now as I was 3 years ago. So this time, instead of analyzing it as a fan of One Piece, I'm going to analyze it as a fan of One Piece. If you haven't seen my previous video on One Piece 2023, you can go watch it for the full background of the story and its development. But in lieu of that, here's an extremely quick refresher. One Piece is a Netflix show adapted from a manga of the same name. It follows the aspiring pirate captain Monkey D. Luffy as he assembles his crew and searches for the mythical treasure known as the One Piece. Joining him on his journey is his first mate, the swordsman and former bounty hunter Roronoa Zoro, his navigator, the thief Nami, his handyman and sniper, the notorious liar Usopp, and his chef, the womanizer Sanji. With Season 2, we get the additions of Nefeltari Vivi, a princess the Straw Hats befriend, and Tony Chopper, an anthropomorphic reindeer that acts as their doctor. During their travels and through their association with Vivi, they attract the attention of a group of assassins known as Baroque Works who are attempting to throw Vivi's kingdom of Alabasta into chaos. Before I get into the additions that'll be the meat of this video, I do want to do a quick rundown of some notable adaptations in Season 2 for the sake of completeness. On the unequivocally good side, we have some continuity fixing, like the early appearances of Bartolomeo and Brook, the Sabo cameo, and some setup for Sanji's full backstory. All of those inclusions lay important groundwork to keep future developments from feeling like the minor retcons they were in the source material. There's also the fact that every Straw Hat gets to do some fighting in every arc. In my One Piece miniseries, I complained that Vivi feels like she doesn't get to actively participate very often, and in my first Netflix One Piece video, I took issue with Usopp not contributing very much during his central arc. Both of those are remedied here. Making the eternal pose that Robin offers the Straw Hats point to a safe but isolated island makes Luffy's decision to break it a much more interesting one. Now, he's effectively making his own life more difficult for the sake of his friends and his convictions, instead of what amounts to stubbornness in the manga. And Miss Golden Week is genuinely threatening and a little terrifying, as befits a higher-ranked assassin, unlike in the manga where she's an apathetic young girl who feels really out of place among the Baroque Works agents. On the other side of the coin, we have the extremely awkward pacing. I don't hate the decision to split the Alabasta saga into 2 seasons, but I do hate that Drum Island is the climax of Season 2. Dedicating almost an entire episode to Chopper's backstory is a jarring speed bump to the very time-sensitive plot, and Walpole just doesn't have the gravitas to be a final boss for the season. My fix would be to have Episode 8 be a full cooldown episode dedicated to setting up the pieces for Season 3. It especially feels like a missed opportunity to cut Ace's introduction from the end of Drum Island, as it would have bookended the reveal in Episode 1 that Roger had a son. Alternatively, this could have been a 10-episode season, Drum Island could have been cut down by half an episode, and the last 2.5 episodes could have covered Alabasta. As it stands, I'm not exactly sure how Season 3 is going to pan out. Assuming it's another 8 episodes, either we're going to be spending more than half a season on just Alabasta, then finishing with a couple episodes on Jaya, or Skypiea is going to be pretty weirdly paced. Both Alabasta and Skypiea have fantastic season-ending moments, so it just strikes me as weird that we're left with Drum Island as a finale for Season 2, then the amazing Alabasta ending won't be utilized for Season 3. Finally, there's the fact that I just really don't like the way Chopper was handled. It's not objectively bad, really. It just feels like every decision they made was the opposite of my personal preference. I would have preferred practical effects Chopper to CGI Chopper, I would have preferred a less high and childish voice, I would have preferred him to not swear, etc. Again, I don't think he's bad per se, I'm just all around dissatisfied with his portrayal. With the newly adapted material out of the way, let's look at the unique additions from both seasons, starting with one of the main themes from Season 1. The thing that separates heroes from villains in One Piece 2023 is idealism. The sentiment of there being good pirates and bad pirates, and good marines and bad marines, is put forth by Luffy and Kobe, then reinforced by their respective squads and villains. With the Marines, we have Kobe as a protagonist with his goal of helping people and living up to his ideals, while the Marine antagonists are Captain Morgan, who believes it's a dog-eat-dog world and he's the end-all be-all, and Captain Nezumi, who's a selfish and petty opportunist. In the middle are Garp, who is pulled between his desire for Luffy to be a Marine, and his belief that doing good is more important than following the law to the letter, and Helmeppo, whose petulance is countered by the fact that he knows he's kind of pathetic. Garp finishes his season's arc when he accepts Luffy's dream and lets go of the past, and Helmepos ends with him standing for what he believes in and vowing to improve himself, making a friend in the process. As for the pirates, idealism directly pays off over and over. The Straw Hats each join the crew in the moment where they give up their cynicism. Zoro decides to join at the end of episode 1, when he chooses to chase his dream instead of remaining a simple bounty hunter. Usopp is on board with the crew from moment 1, because he's already mostly devoid of cynicism, but gives up his guilt and grief at the end of episode 4 to officially join up. Sanji resists joining the Straw Hats because he feels his idealism should be second to his duty to stay with Baratie, but he eventually joins when Zeph berates him for giving up on his dream by continuously putting it off. And after being a jaded mess for the entire season, Nami finally officially joins the crew when she recognizes that she can actually rely on people instead of trying to always go it on her own. On the other side of the coin, we have Buggy, who thinks of himself, his crew, and Luffy as unwanted freaks and is stymied when Luffy isn't affected by his professional level necking. Kuro believes that everyone but him is useless and fully expects to be betrayed, and is therefore blindsided and defeated when Luffy's crew sticks together to their individual detriment, and all contribute in the conflict. And Arlong is so convinced that everything will always be awful for people who aren't at the top of the food chain, that he ends up bullying his own people and driving Nami to a point where she's desperate enough to ask for help. As for Mihawk, he decides to leave Zoro and Luffy alive because he's impressed by the strength of their respective resolves, and he respects people who reach for the stars. In every circumstance, the heroes are the ones who believe things can become better, the villains are the ones who believe in the inherent cruelness of the world, and the ones between eventually become heroes by making a conscious choice to embrace the former over the latter. As a final note on Season 1's additions, before I jump into Season 2, I want to talk about a pair of scenes that might be my favorites in the entire show. The first is at the beginning of Episode 5. The crew has just escaped the Marines, and Luffy's relation to Garp has just been revealed. Luffy is sitting by himself, uncharacteristically subdued, and Nami convinces Zoro to go talk to him. Nami points out that Zoro is the first mate, and he should deal with the complex relationship between crew and captain. Zoro is hesitant because he doesn't think there's anything wrong, but eventually he does go up to Luffy. Zoro bluntly asks if anything's wrong, and if Luffy wants to talk about the fact that his grandpa is a high-ranking Marine, but gets rebuffed. Zoro sees this as mission accomplished, and leaves. The second scene is in Episode 7. The crew has just learned of most of Nami's backstory, and they're understandably distraught. Luffy silently gets up and leaves the house, and after a moment Zoro gets up to follow him. He first sits next to Luffy in silence, then when it seems like Luffy doesn't want to talk, Zoro gets up to leave, but he's interrupted by Luffy deciding to speak. Zoro sits back down, and the two discuss Nami. In the first scene, Zoro has to be coaxed, and he offers no pushback. In the second, he makes the conscious decision to check up on his friend, and while he offers light criticism of Luffy's points, he's clearly just trying to make sure Luffy has fully considered the situation. Individually, the scenes don't mean much, but together they're a compelling pair of character beats. These scenes wouldn't work if they were in the manga. The characters are subtly different in ways that would make them feel completely out of place, if not entirely out of character. But here, with the numerous slight changes to characterization and tone, they work perfectly to cap off a season of development between the captain and his first mate. Moving on to Season 2, the main addition I want to look at is how the individual episodes are constructed. Each one focuses on a specific theme and centers on one or more members of the Straw Hat crew. The clarity and efficacy of that focus is extremely variable, but it is a noticeable throughline that's not just unique to the show, but unique to the medium of episodic TV. Episode 1 is about remembering where you came from. Each of the crew, save Luffy, buys something physical that reminds them of their origin, while also denoting their change in circumstance. Nami buys an atlas of the East Blue that she intends to surpass with her own maps, Usopp buys a pair of goggles that become a mainstay of his equipment loadout, Sanji buys a fish that's the main ingredient of the last recipe he invented before joining the crew, and Zoro buys 2 new swords. The episode climaxes with the crew thwarting enemies that they had previously bested in Season 1, before finally moving on into a world of new experiences. Episode 2 is themed around overcoming helplessness, and is centered on Nami and Luffy. Nami struggles with her inadequacy as a navigator when faced with the uniquely bizarre weather patterns and sea currents of the Grand Line, while Luffy struggles with his inability to get his friends out of danger in a situation where he can't solve the problem by punching it. There's also Usopp hanging helplessly over the pools of stomach acid and needing the entire crew, plus the mildly antagonistic Vivi, to get him to safety. Eventually the episode concludes with Luffy using diplomacy to free his friends, and Nami receiving the proper tools to do her job. Episode 3 is about trust, and specifically trust in oneself, centering on Luffy and Zoro. Luffy trusts his gut about helping Vivi and Igaram, only to be betrayed, while Zoro is frustrated by his inadequacy as a swordsman in comparison to Mihawk. Luffy's gut is eventually vindicated when they find out Vivi's dilemma, and Zoro regains some of his confidence when he single-handedly defeats an entire island full of assassins. Episode's 4th theme is novelty and adventure, centered on Vivi and Usopp. Both initially resist exploring Little Garden, but are drawn in by their friends. That acceptance of adventure is a turning point for Vivi, making her feel like a real member of the crew, and from this moment on, Usopp becomes a much more active force in solving problems. Episode 5 is the Usopp episode, and is therefore about bravery. Usopp is left alone multiple times to solve his own problems, despite doing everything in his power to pass the buck to someone more qualified. His fear isn't unwarranted, as he gets soundly trounced, but his commitment to bravery results in him saving the entire crew. That bravery is further rewarded by his friends continuing to call him the hero of Little Garden, proving they're genuinely proud of him. The episode ends with the crew sailing straight forward towards a giant sea monster acting as bait despite the danger, so the giants can get a clean shot at the beast and get the Straw Hats to safety. As I alluded to earlier, episodes 6 through 8 feel like 2 episodes that got split into 3. For our purposes, that manifests as overlapping themes. 6 and 7 have overlapping themes of leadership, 7 and 8 have overlapping themes of legacy and monstrosity, and 8 also has a unique minor theme of teamwork. As for focus characters, 6 centers on Zoro and Vivi, 7 on Chopper, and 8 on the entire crew. In episodes 6 and 7, Zoro and Vivi both engage with what it means to be a leader and how a leader should act. Zoro and Dalton bond over being thrust into leadership positions they didn't necessarily want, while Vivi is appalled by Walpole's total disregard for his people and is increasingly worried about her own kingdom. In episodes 7 and 8, Chopper's past and present aspirations are both heavily influenced by Herlock, and Dalton similarly reflects on Herlock's dying words as he fights for Drum Island's future. And the fights in episode 8 split the crew into 3 groups of 2, each of which only achieves victory by combining their strengths and working together. Zoro and Usopp defend the village, Sanji and Chopper fight Walpole's lieutenants, and Luffy and Vivi take down Walpole. Overall, this is definitely the weakest arc of the show so far, largely because of the bizarre pacing, and that's apparent in the relatively messy application of themes and focus. While the dialogue and framing clearly imply otherwise, Zoro doesn't really do much in the way of leading, and he and Usopp don't really work together in the final battle so much as fight in the same place. Outside of the individual episodes, there's also 2 new season-long additions. Smoker and Tashigi's attempts to track down both the Straw Hats and Baroque works, and Robin's efforts in cleaning up messes and taunting young women. Smoker and Tashigi's plotline is simple but effective. It follows up on Season 1 adding marine protagonists, and putting a greater focus on Smoker and Tashigi will pay off with their moral quandaries at the climax of Alabasta. It's one more piece of consistency that makes the show feel like a holistic and planned story as opposed to the serialized nature of the manga where some plot beats appear out of nowhere or are abruptly dropped. Robin's plot, on the other hand, isn't about establishing narrative consistency, but instead directly enhances her character. While she spends most of her time dealing with Baroque works business, her most notable scenes involve her personal interests. Robin specifically goes after people who remind her of herself. Tashigi, confined by her responsibilities and marine orders, and Vivi, constantly on the run trying to complete her mission while enlisting the assistance of a pre-existing group with its own goals. With foreknowledge of Robin's past and current motivations, this comes off as insecurity and frustration with her own circumstances. That's a fantastic way to deepen her character for this part of the story, while simultaneously setting up her future plotlines. It's an excellent choice on the part of the writers, and it is fully unique to the show. When a work is transferred from one medium to another, most of the focus will be on the fact that it is an adaptation. How does it portray things differently? What does it leave out or change? Does it satisfy fans of the original? I'm definitely guilty of that as well. After all, my first video on Netflix's One Piece was about how it worked as an adaptation. But while that is a worthwhile endeavor, it can't be the end of the analysis. The people who work on adaptations deserve to have their work critiqued with more depth than a basic comparison to the source material. Obviously, One Piece 2026 exists in the context of the manga it was based on, but temporarily ignoring that context reveals why it works so well. Yes, it's a faithful adaptation in both spirit and largely in content, but more importantly, it's a good show in and of itself. The writers, directors, actors, set and costume designers, musicians, and other assorted artists may have had a strong jumping off point, but it would be a massive disservice to ignore how much of their unique contributions elevate the work.